It's day 2 in Paul's letter to the church in Galatia. This is his most intense letter that he's written, or at least letter that he's written that we know of. He starts off pretty angry in chapter 1. He doesn't include this whole section about thanking God for them. He just gets right down to business. He's upset that they have embraced a different form of teaching. The belief, the practice, the false teaching was that you had to become Jewish before you followed Jesus, meaning you had to obey you had to do the works of the law, and you had to be circumcised. So again, this is like listening into one side of a telephone conversation. You have to try to connect the dots here. So that's the issue. He calls this a different gospel. It's a different message. He's not saying it's slightly tweaked. They added a little bit to it. He's like, no, it's different and it's useless because it's not about what you do. It's about trusting Jesus. So he goes into it and he continues his argument for credibility. He says in verse 1, after 14 years, that's a long time, he finally goes up to Jerusalem to meet with the disciples. And he brings Barnabas, who was his mentor, and Titus, who was somebody Paul was mentoring. So he goes there and he says that Peter, James, and John, or at certain points he refers to Peter as Cephas, same guy. Peter, James, and John gave him the right hand of fellowship, meaning like Jesus had his 12 disciples, but then within those 12, there were 3 that were super close. It was like the inner circle. That was Peter, James, and John. He's like, those 3 gave me the right hand of fellowship. They gave me the stamp of approval. And so he's like, they, especially Peter, they go and tell Jewish people about Jesus. He's like, I'm going to everyone else, or the Gentiles, all the non-Jews. Now think about this. If you're telling Jewish people about Jesus, and the big issue is whether or not you should be Jewish first, for them it's a non-issue because they're already Jewish. They've already been circumcised. They don't really have to think about this thing that was such a problem for Paul. But for Paul, things are a lot messier because he's dealing with people who have very, very different religious views. Then he explains this conflict he has with Peter, which is pretty interesting. I don't know if I would have wanted to watch this, but maybe. I don't know. The two of them go head to head. So Peter, all right, in the book of Acts, he has this vision where God tells him that the Gentiles, the non-Jews, should be included in this. And it's not about obeying the works of the law and you can eat whatever you want. There's a big grand scene. It's a turning point in the book of Acts. And it changes the way that Peter believes. It changes like the way he thinks about God. All of a sudden he sees, okay, everybody's included in this. And so for a while, Peter embraces everybody, right? But then Paul finds out that Peter has changed his approach. It says he used to eat with Gentiles, but eventually, like what happened was other people came in who had these views that you had to first be Jewish before you could follow Jesus. And Peter gets a little intimidated by these people, and so he stops eating with Gentiles. Now, this, for Paul, is an even bigger deal than saying that they have to get circumcised. Like, to eat with someone was to accept them, to embrace them. And now he's saying, no, I'm not going to eat with you. It's not just that I don't want to hang with you. He's saying, I don't accept you. And what he's communicating unintentionally is that God does not accept them either. So Paul just goes at him, calls him out in front of everybody. And he says this. So he's arguing for his credibility, but then he's like, look, I believe so strongly in this. Galatians, you are not the only ones being called out. I had to tell Peter that he was off the mark. And again, it really wouldn't have been a big issue for Peter, the whole circumcision thing. He could pretty much do his job because all his people were circumcised to begin with. But when Paul sees that he's pushing out Gentiles or doesn't want to eat with them, he's got a problem. And then in verse 15, this is just a little Bible reading tip, right? Pay attention to the quotes, because in verse 15 and going all the way to 21 for the rest of chapter 2, this is a speech he's giving to Peter. He's calling out Peter and he's like, and this is what I said. So he says, basically he explains his doctrinal beliefs. He's like, look, we are Jews by nature, not sinners from the Gentiles, or not like sinful Gentiles. Now he's setting up his argument here. He's not just throwing punches at the Gentiles. He's like, nevertheless, knowing that a person isn't justified, like made right with God, by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus, through trusting in Jesus, we believed in Jesus, so that we may be justified by faith, by trusting, and not by the works of the law, since by the works of the law, no flesh, no person will be justified. And then he goes on and he explains, he says something that might be a little bit confusing here. He says, but if while seeking to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have also been found sinners, is Christ a servant of sin? Far from it. For if I rebuild what I once destroyed, I prove myself to be a wrongdoer. He's explaining there's life change that happens, but it happens through trusting in Jesus. And then he says this really powerful phrase here, and it's translated differently depending on what version you have. In the NASB, it says, verse 19, for through the law I died to the law so that I might live for God. Let's see what the NIV says. It says, for through the law I died to the law so that I might live for God. Okay, says the same exact thing, which is great. In essence, what he's saying is, for through the law I died to the law so that I might live for God. The shift there is my religious life, my standing with God, is not based on submission to regulations. It's built on a trusting relationship. Both of those things outwardly can look similar at times, right? You might do something because it's written in a list of rules, or you might do something because you trust the one who says that's no good for you. But what's happening internally is radically different. And here then Paul associates himself with Jesus, like super, in like a super tight way. He says in verse 20, I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Jesus himself is living in me. And the life which I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. He's like, this is my motive for living. He's like, I'm living, but Jesus is also living in me and through me. But either way, what I'm doing, I am living by trusting in him because he loved me and he gave everything for me. That's like that. The end of that is really jam-packed there. But now remember, it's in a speech to Peter. And so then he closes and he says, I don't nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly. That would have hit Peter like pretty hard. Peter watched Jesus die. And so he's like bringing it all the way back to why Jesus showed up and what he came to do. This was a super strong appeal to Peter's personal relationship with Jesus. He says, in the NIV says, I don't set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. Very close to the NASB. Nullify or set aside. He's like, it's all about God's grace, his favor, his concern for you, the fact that he's in your corner. And Jesus died to show us that. But if you could be right with God simply by obeying the rules, he's like, then Peter, why did Jesus show up and go through what he went through? So there's a lot going on there. But I think it's important to remember that all this passion from Paul is what he's fighting for is resisting arbitrary rules and regulations. It's not about just doing the right thing. It's about trusting the one who wants what's best for you and loved you and gave himself for you. So today, at any point when you're thinking about doing something, or when God comes into your mind, check your motive. Is your motive to do the right thing? Or is it to live in a relationship, trusting relationship, like, okay, I'm going to do this, not because it's the right thing, but because I trust the one who loved me and gave himself for me. Big point. That's chapter 2. See you tomorrow.